Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I would like to collectively acknowledge that the land on which this session is originating from is the Robinson Huron Treaty Area of the Anishinaabe people. I'd like to thank Jeff Godlinski for putting together the Mountain Connect Conference, which this session is part of, and for inviting us to be part of this great lineup. On that, my name is Amedeo Bernardi. I am founder of Canada's Rural and Remote Broadband Conference. I also have a small consulting firm that, especially in recent times, has been focused on the challenges of rural broadband connectivity faced by both communities and service providers. So without further ado, the panelists will introduce themselves, give their background, and we'll get into the topic. So Stuart, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off.
Thanks, Amedeo. I'm Stuart Morley with Parry Sound Muskoka Community Network. We're a non-profit funded by the federal government, and we're one of 5 of these agencies that are funded across Northern Ontario. One of the agencies in Thunder Bay, another one in Sault Ste. Marie, one in Timmins, one in North Bay, and we're based in Muskoka. Our objective in the past was to hand out millions of dollars for the federal government to help get better broadband coverage. In recent years, since the federal government has centralized a lot of that fund distribution, we now have an advocacy role in addition to several other roles that we carry out on behalf of the federal government.
Thanks, Stuart. David, if you could care to go and introduce yourself and your background.
Thanks, Amedeo. So I'm David Pickett with RDMG Management Group. I'm a partner there, and I specialize in providing financial advisory. I assist municipalities, especially lately, with the financial due diligence in assessing the risk and making investments into broadband networks. These networks range from regional networks through to even establishment of a retail ISP. I'm also engaged as a controller with a retail-based ISP in Newmarket, Ontario.
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. Rob?
Hi, I'm Rob Barlow. I'm a board member, consultant, and advisor who's been working on broadband for 25 years. My background is from the wireless industry with some foundational infrastructure like 4G, and then created a company over the past 11 years and recently exited, which delivered broadband to underserved areas of Canada. And so today I am helping communities and municipalities and towns figure out how they're going to finance these deals as they build out infrastructure.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate it. And Mr. Lampron, Dave.
Thanks, Amedeo. My name is Dave Lampron. I'm the Chief Information Officer for a small rurally based community college in northern British Columbia. I've spent the better part of the last 20 years in technology related roles, working with rural communities to try to deliver essential services like healthcare and education to rural areas. And increasingly have tripped over the connectivity issue as we've tried to do that. I spent a few years as the Chief Operating Officer for a middle mile open access network in southeastern British Columbia. And I continue to be active in the rural broadband space.
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. You know, what's funny thing is I've organized conferences, but I will hats off to all the moderators that I've asked to do this because it's way trickier. The space button, by the way, on Zoom actually adds a lot of words on my screen. So thanks to all of you. So just to remind everybody, the topic we're covering today is innovative rural broadband community models in Canada, with the various operating models that communities could seek to implement and the inherent business planning required. But based on our lead up discussions with this great panel, I think this chat today will not be so much focused on debating known models like the open model and P3 and community owned, et cetera, in as much as what we are all now seeing in the midst of the demands that responding to COVID-19 related pressures are bringing to bear on the communities. So with that proviso, I'd like to start off with Stewart, who works very closely with a myriad of diverse rural communities in a central part of Ontario. Stewart, you had mentioned in our discussions that you felt that everything that could have been done by ISPs has been done or addressed. Do you want to elaborate on that, and what do you see as possible paths forward?
Yes, Amedeo, thank you. So when I make that kind of comment, in a traditional marketplace, if it was working well, every customer that wanted a service and could afford it would be able to get that service. We don't have that situation now. What the ISPs that I work with tell me is anything that is economical to roll out has already been rolled out. And in fact, in the rural areas, what's happening is the only additional work they're doing is where they are receiving government grants. And in some areas, these grants are getting up to 50% of the cost or higher. And so this is not a traditional marketplace for ISPs. However, there is one model that one of the ISPs has been discussing with us, which is that they don't have access to long-term finance the way the very big telcos have, or those kinds of opportunities. So they'd be pitching to us that if they could get, say, 20-year money at a very low interest rate, a loan from, say, a municipality or those kinds of organizations, they can improve their penetration in the rural areas. It's not a solution totally, but it would keep the wheels going while we're in a situation now where everybody's waiting on additional funding grants from the federal government and they're not yet announced. So an example would be, and I'm not talking very, very tiny ISPs, but some of the more medium-sized ones, they could probably get money for 3 to 5 year type money from the current banking system. But if they could get 20-year money at a good low interest rate, they're saying that they could economically fund, for example, fiber, where at the moment they can only fund an area where there's, say, 14 houses per kilometer to make it economical. They could get it down as low as, say, 7 houses per kilometer if they could attract that kind of 20-year money. So here's some examples of more community type thinking of long-term money that may help help communities in the shorter term.
Thanks, Stuart. And anybody want to weigh on that? Rob, you have recent experience with 20.
Yeah, so I guess, 20-year money comes with 20-year commitment and securitization. So one of the models that I'm seeing work, and it's in play right now, and it's only in play because there was a roll-up of 14 or 15 communities, and they tried for 2.5 years to get corporate finance, or sorry, government incentive. And so what they've done is they've actually themselves put together a low interest loan, created their own telco development company, and created a economic development engine through selecting an ISP to work with, and they shared in the profits, put in the seed capital, which is the working capital required to get things started, are going to build a network and then go to market with alternative financiers to take out that long-term asset with revenues on it that they've done all the construction risk or market risk with. So if you think of it, I mean, I think we have to turn things in a hybrid model. There's not one financing model that fits. I think that you have to have willing parties that want to work together. It also works really well with scale. Rolling up multiple cities and towns and sharing resources and creating a pool of opportunity actually lowers the cost and attracts people to come to give you that longer term financing that has a lower risk to it.
Well, that's quite insightful, Rob, and I'm familiar with some of the projects you're talking about. The projects, Dave, based on your background, especially where you were, how do you feel about that? And what would you see as potential path forward and something that, would something like this work?
I think it would. Actually, what Rob is describing is very much a model that we had at least theoretically put down on paper and had taken a substantial geographic area in southeastern BC and had run the numbers. I'd say the substantial challenge wasn't that there wasn't a business case, because there actually was, and these are some pretty rural locations, but it's really getting over that construction risk, right? So getting people around the fact that the business case doesn't exist for the traditional dominant carriers, but does exist if you're looking at paybacks of 10, 15, 20 years. I'd say the predominant factor that was missing, and Stewart may have more insight, and maybe this is just unique to my jurisdiction, is the challenge of coordinating municipalities and counties or regional districts, depending on what you refer to them as, to get the scale that Rob was just talking about, because that scale is really important. Because I think, Rob, one of the things you described in previous conversations was around iterating. So you can basically break out a large business case that has a lot of scale, but then work it into phases. And then as you get sort of the construction and the asset in place, then that securitizes sort of the financing that comes for the next phases. In order to do that, at least in Canada, over vast geographic areas, you've got to get regional government together. And that, in my view, has been a large challenge, because oftentimes regional government in Canada are used to dealing with localized problems, or sewer systems, or their solid waste systems. And, I think solving the connectivity gap is a systemic problem. The more scale you have, the more you're in this together. It's a bit of a rinse and repeat. So in many cases, it's not the business case that's lacking. I think Rob's articulation was really good. I think the business case would work over that longer payback period. It's a herding cats problem.
And David, so I'd like to move the discussion into, sort of the analysis portion, which is the other part of the topic is, we're picking on this 20 and 30 year and the multi-community model. And I hone in on community because we are all part of projects where it's not just municipalities, but it's municipalities and Indigenous communities. And as we've seen in previous conferences and discussions, the intricacies of those relationships and bringing everybody together. David, I know you're part of a project like that. So what are you seeing from the analysis perspective and the partnerships and the assessment of the business case?
There's a few different things to look at here. So, one thing we see is there's a high reliance on funding, outside funding from higher levels of government that the municipalities and the regional governments look at. One thing is, they can get a subsidy by, competing in a special purpose broadband fund, and that's a one-time, subsidy to the capital, but they don't always necessarily look at the ongoing operating requirements that might be involved in a business case. And we're talking about projects here that are, in fact, 20+ year projects. This is infrastructure, and it needs to be considered as such. It's not necessarily a 5 to 7 year business where a typical investor would look at, if I'm going to invest in this, what's my exit strategy? You need to have a much longer investment horizon. And I think the municipalities get that, but trying to match the financing with that, characterized investment, I think has been challenging. So some of the broadband funds that are out there do help address maybe the upfront sticker price, but it does seem to be a lot of contesting between municipalities to try and win those awards. I think other tools like municipal guarantees that Stewart had mentioned, and mobilizing institutions like Infrastructure Ontario, maybe crown corporations that have access to the capital markets that can get that lower cost financing to help the business case, because from most of the projects that I've been advising on, you know, we're looking at internal rates of return that are, you know, in some cases they can be positive and they can be attractive to the right type of investor, but a lot of private investors, if you're trying to attract them to invest in these projects, it doesn't even come close to what they're looking for without any kind of funding to reduce their leverage. So I think, you know, leveraging some of those other sources like the infrastructure, like if the province wanted to really move money, you know, ICON is nice, which is their infrastructure, Ministry of Infrastructure, $150 million fund. It'll help cover some of the CapEx with some of these projects that people are applying for throughout the rest of 2020 and into next year. But using a vehicle like Infrastructure Ontario or some other, you know, Crown Corporation to provide low cost loans or those guarantees that Stewart was mentioning could be the way to empower these regions to get this infrastructure built. Because, you know, Infrastructure Ontario, their mandate is to fund infrastructure projects. They do it for bridges, toll roads, hospitals, etc. So why not broadband? I think there's definitely a case to be made there.
Well, thanks, David. And, you know, when we were all chatting about this, the lead up to this, Dave, you had mentioned that the focus probably shouldn't be on grants, that communities should focus elsewhere. Did you want to, you know, talk about that a bit? Because that's where David was going.
Yeah, I think David articulated it really well. I mean, you know, grants are, they're a way to use clearly limited funding. So there isn't enough funding to resolve the problem. And so then you basically run communities through a contest to give away that limited funding. And what, at least in Canada, what it misses, I can't speak to the US state of affairs, is that connectivity really should be declared an essential service. And so the grant funding is nowhere near enough to subsidize the capital that's required to bridge that business case. And so if you look at it just simply from, well, if this is an essential service at a national level, then why are we running a contest for delivering that essential service? And then, you know, who is going to be best placed to win the contest? Well, probably the communities that are actually have more capacity are going to be better placed to put proposals together that will win the contest, which actually further marginalizes those really remote communities which are kind of struggling for that capacity. And so, you know, I think David really did a good job of basically painting a picture of, I think, the grant funders, both the federal grant funders and the provincial equivalents, which often become kind of two pieces of a puzzle. Applicants will often go to the federal funds, and then they'll also go to the provincial funds, and then they'll try to marry those together, and then, you know, do some fundraising at a local level and maybe get some private investment. It would seem to me that the grant funds really should be looking at those investment horizons that are much longer and be looking at trying to solve the problem once and for all, because ultimately, if we have too short of a horizon, then the same applicants are back 5 or 6 years later, especially the wireless ones, where basically that's the cycle of infrastructure replacement. And they're back to the trough again saying, I can't operate without getting, you know, without getting that subsidy. Otherwise my solvency, you know, I just won't be able to basically sort of keep things going with modern equipment. And so if our grant funders were basically looking at this as a 20-year horizon and building the infrastructure, and I think that infrastructure is still predominantly fiber and fiber to the home or fiber to the farm or fiber to the cottage or whatever it is, that to put that infrastructure in place that solves the problem for the foreseeable future with a business case that, as David said, actually covers that operating cost as well as covers the renewal costs that will have to happen in 20 or 25 years. And that's, the grant funding should help to incentivize that. But I really do think that the federal government and the provincial equivalent should be looking at creating financing options that allow applicants to access that financing. Canada's trying it with our Canada Infrastructure Bank. However, the Infrastructure Bank is looking for, I think the ratio that they're looking for is something like two private dollars for every public dollar that the financier puts in. And unfortunately, for most rural locations in Canada, that's just not a viable model. Like you can do like, you know, rural Toronto maybe, where really it's just like you're kind of doing suburban Toronto, but that model really won't apply to truly rural locations. So I think, you know, I'd be encouraging our grant funders to be looking at their piece as a piece of a larger model that's trying to solve the problem once and for all.
Bob, that kind of leads me to a point you had made. You said the funders are evolving and process, and I think this is a great time to talk about that. You know, we are talking about innovative models for communities. So what does that mean with, you know, with the intent of potential models and what communities can look at and get ready for the next wave?
Yeah, so I just think today there's not one funding model that's a cookie cutter. I think that everybody is, you know, realizing that publicly traded companies are incented by shareholder value, but communities have a different driver. And so, but they don't want to put their hard-earned, you know, low interest bond money into broadband. They want to put it into bridges and homes for seniors, like their housing crisis that they have. So I think that you're going to look at the future holds where we're going to be saying, okay, here's a community project. It's a smart, it could be a smart community. We can have, you know, parking meters that actually can pay. You could actually bill the customer immediately. There's way more ways to monetize your tax base with technology. Today, streetlights come with fiber in them, and you can even order them with cameras. So what's happening is you're going to see the ability to create projects and then basically go and get funding sources in a competitive model, much like you do today for startup companies. So I think it's going to be interesting, though, when the government finally does realize that fiber to the press is just that, that the model in Canada, at least, probably is only going to deliver very little return based on the amount of effort. The size and complexity of what they're trying to do is, Canada's a big place, and there's a lot of swampland in between, and we can't afford to put network where nobody lives. And so you're going to see things like Stuart's explanation of, you know, flow through taxation things come on the table. Large crown corporations are going to want to bid on these things. So I basically see a future where community networks become very valuable. People understand it. It's going to impact them from a social economic perspective. If you have broadband in your community, your real estate, people are going to move there if there's actually broadband in your home that you're going to buy. So I really think that this model is evolving, and if there was an ecosystem of people really like pushing forward to realize this, then things will get better. I just think right now we're kind of stuck in the whole legacy model where publicly traded companies are trying to do their best to actually produce a dividend, and are doing a good job of it. But then you've got a social impact that we're have yet to figure out how to match those two, but it will come with technology.
So you touched on a bunch of stuff, and I'm so glad you did. two things in particular for me, and I'll let everybody else comment, but I do want you to expand a little bit on your fiber or your fiber to the press comment, just, a minute, because that's a whole other topic that we're going to do at a whole other conference. And then secondly, I think you also nailed the part where, we're stuck in a legacy model versus measuring the social impact. And each one of us have had these discussions one-on-one. And I know David and I are part of one project where one of our project members said, we shouldn't be looking at 8% return. Maybe we should be happy as a 1% return and try to measure the social impact in our communities and measure what is happening there. And I know, Stuart and I talked about it this morning, David. And so, did anybody want to jump in on, well, first, Rob, if you want to talk about fiber to the press, but then if anybody wants to pick up on the legacy versus measuring the social impact and how that can affect the model and thinking out of the box.
Yeah, so when I say fiber to the press, it's really easy to announce a project. We've had many projects announced all around the world. It's not just Canada or the United States. It's you're doing something for your constituents. The attempt to stimulate broadband, it's recognized how it increases gross domestic product. You don't have to extend existing networks very far to get the value. So we hear a lot about it, but when you ask for results, our track record isn't very good when it comes to governments actually doing these types of things. And so you have to get more to a grassroots level, and you have to realize that there's different players. And I just think that everything is evolving. I mean, the pandemic has exasperated the problem, identified it, that it's a lot worse than people wanted to admit. And so I think when you put things under pressure, cracks show, and it's our job now to actually evolve this thing.
Oh, thanks, Rob. And does anybody want to pick up on, honing in more on the social impact and how that should be reflected in our models and our planning? Stuart.
Yes, so there are isolated studies of the impact that if you have better internet, how much you can reduce healthcare costs and be able to help people in the home. There is the impact in education, which we're all talking about. There's the impact on being able to do business faster and better. There are a lot of rural homes that actually have a small business in the home. I think some of the stats out of the US, 1 in 10 homes has a small business that runs out of it, which if there's decent internet, that can become an online business. So there are all these social impacts, but we don't seem to have found a lot of people willing to actually put it in a package and use that as a marketing package to the community, saying, this is worth that and this is worth that, and all these different elements. But I think that's where we would be going if we really wanted to make this a community-driven project that works.
Thanks, Stuart. And we have 2 minutes left, so I'd like to get some final thoughts. Does anybody want to continue on with that thought, or does anybody have something else they want to share?
Well, I'll go.
No, you go ahead, Rob, please.
I just want to say, I think broadband, we've got all the people in this conference and on this session here have been advocates for broadband, and we've worked for publicly traded companies and we've worked for communities, and we all want the same thing, really. It's just that we have different performance metrics of success. So I think it's important that we recognize that projects today, like mental health projects and normal health, like testing for COVID, it all requires digital access to the economy. So it's going to get to the point where you're going to be like, it's a no-brainer. It's always going to have a social impact.
I want to thank each one of you individually. I'd like to thank everyone that's taken the time to watch this session, and of course the organizers and Jeff, Mountain Connect, and Calix. So again, thanks a lot. You'll have all our contact information on our bio, so please feel free to reach out to all these this great team, and I'm sure everybody would engage in further discussion. So we'll leave it at that from our Canadian crew. Everyone have a great day. Thanks, team.
Thank you.